This is a very broad talk, and it's really just to give you a bit of perspective of how we approach things and what we think some of the issues are, and also to get some discussion going. You know, is this what you think as well? Is this how things are going to go in the future? So it's a helicopter view. It's very much at the big picture level, but I hope I can give you some illustrations along the way as well. So I want to talk first about the health side of things. How do we link food to health? What can we do in the future? Where will that go? What does the science tell us in that respect? What can we learn from the past? That's back to the future. What is happening in the food industry? And I'll talk about additives and subtractives and explain what that means. But also look a bit more generally and saying, okay, with all of that background, where do we see the opportunities into the future for the food industry in Australia? So those are the topics that I'm going to go through. So how do we link food to health? Well, we've done it because we come up with all of these images, campaigns, slogans, general health advice, and they're reasonably consistent around the world. There really isn't a great deal of difference if you go to different jurisdictions. So here we have whoops, wrong one. Go back. So here we have an Australian version, a US version, a UK version, but you can go to other parts of the world and you'll see different representations, but essentially the same sort of thing. So the modern way of doing this is to try and encapsulate a whole diet in terms of a plate. And of course, the first thing we have to point out that our health comes from our whole diet, so it's the integration of everything we eat over the whole time period. So it's not a single meal, it's not a single component and so on, and that's the challenge. All right, so that we know that it's an integrative process. How do we represent that in a way that is clear to consumers to help guide choices? The current thinking is that people can respond to what should look like on a plate because that's something that's real and it's there. If you ask people to say, what's the percentage of protein in your diet over the next 2 weeks? No one's going to be able to answer that question. That's what the scientists would like us to keep control of. But in terms of practical issues, this is how we do it. And there's various levels of detail, and you can look at national characteristics here. The US is the most simplistic, and perhaps actually the most impactful in my view, because when you get to the Australian one, that's just too complex. Now, how are we going to look at that? How do you look at that? The UK one is a little bit in between. So we don't use a knife if we're in the US, we do it in the UK, and that is actually true. Most people in the US, they will cut their food up and then eat it with a fork. So we have very different ways in which we eat our foods as well. So we have to ask the question, where does that come from, and what is missing? One of the things that's certainly missing is the idea that exercise or bodily activity is a corollary to the food that we take in. So I quite like this one from Nutrition Australia, where the food pyramid is moving, and it gives you that idea that there's this balance between energy intake and energy expenditure, which is obvious. So where does the information come from that allows us to draw these rather simple representations? And it's the reality that our health comes from this whole integration of what we eat, the circumstances in which we eat them, the lifestyle effect, but also something about the person that's doing the eating. So there is a genetic component in there as well. So it's always, I would suggest, some combination of our health prospects from what we eat, what other things we're doing, and what our genetics tells us. But in terms of the diet component, which is obviously where we can have the most influence from an agriculture and food perspective, it is that integration. So it's not about a particular individual component, it's about the integration of everything we eat over the whole time period that gives us our combined health outcomes. And that nutritional value of a food or of a whole diet is not just a sum of molecular components. So it's not just a question of how much of molecule X, Y, Z is in the diet. It's a lot to do with how it's all packaged together. So you can have the same composition, but packaged in different ways will have different health effects. And I'll try and explain that through the talk as well. So this is a challenge at the moment for regulators. We regulate our foods, or we label our foods in terms of composition. That isn't enough. That doesn't tell you how good it's going to be or how bad it's going to be for our health. So where does the information come from? Almost entirely it comes from epidemiology. Now, this is the science where you have people who are recording everything they eat, and over a period of time, their medical history. So it's a very simple but very large-scale data collection and correlation analysis. So the power of statistics and the way in which you interrogate that data becomes very important in terms of the types of messages you get out. But that data continues to get richer. There are of the order of more than 1 million people around the world who are engaged in these epidemiological sets. The largest ones have hundreds of thousands of people in them. So this is a very rich data set in terms of numbers. But obviously there are limitations to how accurately people will record what they eat, and also the extent to which they will record their health outcomes. So there's going to be limitations in terms of the raw data, the quality of the recording of the food intake and of the health outcomes. And then there's the challenge of how do you just relate these two very broad data sets one to the other, and that's the challenge of the science of epidemiology. Of course, now we have the opportunity to make this much more individual specific. So now that we're into the era where we can realistically get the genomes or have genomic information about each of the participants in epidemiological trials, this is going to make this incredibly more rich. So much more data is going to come from this as we start to see people coming through epidemiological trials who also have that genetic component fingerprinted. It's going to take some time to come through, but that is happening, and that will impact a lot in the future. That will enable us to tease apart some of the diet and genetics effects. So that's really the way in which in the future is going to go. This is about the prediction of predisposition. So what are we as an individual predisposed to in terms of health or lack of health? And that's around the epidemiology, which tells you either at the whole population level or at subpopulations, depending on various categorizations, and your individual predisposition from your genome. So this is coming. This will happen. It's going to be in a few years yet, but this is almost certain that this is going to drive people's understandings of what they are susceptible to and therefore what they should be looking after. The other side of that is, okay, if that's what I'm susceptible to, where am I on that journey? So what are my biomarkers? How far am I? What's my current status? And again, this is an area where there's a lot of information that's already available. Largely it's in the clinical setting, so this is what you would do if you have a panel of clinical data when you present yourself for treatment. But again, increasingly this is going to become more of an individual thing, because the ability to measure these things will become more available to individuals, and it'll be a question of individual choice and what do you want to know. At the moment, a lot of what we measure has to come through blood analysis, which is obviously challenging for self-diagnosis, but in the future, and we're already getting there, an analysis of more easily obtained materials, so breath, saliva, feces, urine, all of that is available, and for those areas where there's a connection between human health and those measurements, then we can predict these will become consumer measurement diagnosis devices. These will come, these are happening. The technology is here. It's a question of what you measure. So that's really the assessment of your current health and well-being status. So my view is it's really a combination of those two. What are you predisposed to? What's your current status? That's really what you would like to have in terms of making informed, personalized dietary decisions. And as I say, it's coming. It's going to take a while, but we've got to keep our eyes on this, because this is what will drive consumer responses and consumer needs. The ability to measure where people are and say, oh no, I've got a reading of 3, it needs to be 2, or I've got a reading of 6 and it needs to be 20. People will respond to that because they can measure it again. So this is how weight loss diets are, of course, the classic example, because you can literally weigh yourself and therefore monitor how well you're doing. Most other dietary interventions, it's difficult without going to the doctor to know how you're doing. And so this ability to self-measure will, in my view, change the way in which people make choices about the foods that they eat, because they'll be able to measure on an ongoing basis how their various biomarkers are changing. So that's the very big picture. So what about the food side of things? And generally when people talk about health, they tend to focus on single ingredients. That's true in a few cases, but it's not the general rule. So there are obviously some things we need to have without which we have deficiency diseases. Fortunately, in countries like Australia, that's not a problem anymore. We have to keep alert to it, but it's not really a big issue. And on the other side of things, in terms of beneficial molecules, seldom the case that there's a single molecule that's beneficial for a particular reason. There's normally a number of solutions to a beneficial opportunity. And of course, it's not just what's there, it's not the molecular components, it's how they're wrapped up, what's the physical form in the meal. So the difference between eating a whole fruit and a fruit juice is already captured in terms of the dietary advice. So we have advice to eat so many portions of fruits and vegetables, only one of which should be in the juice form. And that's because of epidemiological information that you need that intact whole tissue structure to get some of the benefits, apparently, just from correlation. And therefore, it's not just a question of the molecules you eat, the physical form in which you eat them is also important. We also have to bear in mind that it's not just, again, what we eat, but it's how long we take to digest it. So our bodies, in terms of our cravings and needs for foods, are responding to what we've eaten, particularly in the last 24 to 48 hours, because most food takes about that long to completely clear through the system. So the way your stomach's feeling now, anticipating lunch, is really some sort of heritage of what you've had in breakfast, last night's meal, all the meals of yesterday, and possibly even what you had the previous night, because that's how long it can take for our food to go through our system. So all the time food's going through our system, there are hormonal signals being generated and various feedback loops going on. Our brain is aware of consequences of what we ate the day before yesterday. So these things are not in isolation, there's a continuing history in there as well. And this is where we start to think about what did our bodies evolve to digest? And this is where we're seeing into the Back to the Future argument. So just to précis what I'm going to say now, I mean, our evolution requires many, many generations. Hundreds, if not thousands of generations to get an efficient evolutionary choice. So we can think about that in terms of what we were like hundreds of generations ago and what's happened to our food supply in that period. So to me, this is quite a powerful argument about the nature of us as organisms, what we have evolved to eat versus what we are currently eating. So can we learn from the past? So here's one not particularly flattering cartoon of where we are in our evolutionary trajectory. So this is the cyclical nature. I guess this is the circle of life here, that we're going back to a hunched status, but this time over machines rather than with 4 legs. And of course, this is absolutely non-linear in terms of time. So if you put the times on there, we're talking about millions of years ago when we made the transition through from apes to hominids, and then a long time as hunters and gatherers, and depending on the part of the world you're in, between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago when we started to settle and become agricultural and therefore control our food supply more rather than hunting for it. And it's only a couple of hundred years that we've had industrialization of anything, so the Industrial Revolution, and it's really only been in the last 100 years that that's taken through into the food industry. And then our lifestyles have changed and are continuing to change dramatically over the last decades, primarily because of information technology and the move of activities, both jobs and recreational, from movement to static. And of course that has a big effect on the consequence for our health. So the big point is that those early stages were on the time scale that would be considered evolutionary, but that when we start to talk about the agricultural and post-agricultural era, it's unlikely that there's been much evolution over that period. There simply has not been enough generations of us to make a selectable choice, and therefore we are essentially working with the bodies that evolved during our time as hunters and gatherers, or even earlier than that. So that's the point I wanted to make there. Well, it's quite a common point a number of people make, but to me it's a very powerful one. So in terms of the pre-agricultural diet, it was very variable because it was a hunted and gathered diet and therefore depended on the location and environment. But typically there was what we would now call vegetables and fruits were a high portion of that diet, and then there were variable, and this is an area that there's a lot of debate at the moment, to what extent, what were the protein sources in diets from the hunting and gathering, how much of it was hunting of animals or fishing, how much was eggs or other protein sources, but there must have been some protein there. And that's a very limited diet in terms of what we know today, And then at the post-agricultural diet, the two big changes. One was we started farming grains, so grains became our dominant energy source. Prior to that, they were part of a whole diet of gathered plant materials, but it wouldn't have been the major form of energy. And likewise dairy, so before agriculture there was little, if any, milking of animals, and the only milk that people got was the mother's milk for the first few years of their life. But this, as filled in, and this in the form of the triangle or pyramid, and this has been considered to be the standard human diet. But we have to remember this is not what we evolved to eat. We are already challenging our digestive systems by the inclusion of a large amount of grains and inclusion of dairy out of something which, on top of a diet which we took millennia to evolve to digest. And of course, this thing is collapsing all over the place now. So this is the challenge then is that we as humans are really hardwired to seek food. Quite obviously, this is what we need to survive. And food that gives immediate satisfaction, also we are hardwired to enjoy and to accept. So that it's not that we shouldn't feel guilty about that. This is just what we are. We respond to fat and to salt and to sugar in a positive way. This is what our bodies crave, for good reason, because that's what we need. The fats, sugar, salt represent lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, the things that we need to survive. So we are out there as hunters and gatherers. We are seeking these fatty, sweet, salty tastes. And so we shouldn't be surprised that we gravitate towards those. And this has really all been wrapped up by a number of people, and this is my favorite article in this area, that really looks at what the comparison is between the pre-agricultural diet and the modern diet, and all the ways in which things have changed over the intervening period. And so I love the phrase, this evolutionary collision. So that we have an ancient genome and we have a modern food supply, and the two are clashing, and that there are consequences for that. And indeed, if you look through this and other articles of this sort, there's really quite clear lines between the differences in pre-agricultural diets and current diets, and the prevalence of the various chronic diseases that we worry about in terms of diet induction. So the epidemiology that links all these things together is pretty strong. The correlations are robust, they are repeatable, many of them seem to be across different regions of the world, but epidemiology is a correlation science. So it tells you nothing about cause and effect. It just tells you that these things seem to go hand in hand. And you don't know whether those are very intimately linked through a cause and effect mechanism or whether they are distantly related, and there's all sorts of intervening processes that go on. So this cause and effect relationship, this is one of the main things that we try and investigate. And it's really looking at you have to look at this thing from what are the molecules there, what are the biological origins of the food, and what are the physical properties of those foods. That whole combination is what will eventually lead you to some understanding of how these things are related. So it's not just the composition of the molecule and the structure of the food, but also the fact that each type of dietary component has multiple in-body effects. So this is not like a pharmaceutical thing where you want one molecule with one effect and no side effects. And that's the ideal pharmaceutical. That is not nutrition. Nutrition is almost as far away from that as you can get. It's multiple molecules, multiple effects. And this makes a lot of sense. So we don't want to be reliant on single molecules for particular health benefits. We have to have the ability to get the benefits from a multiple array of molecules. So this is one of the challenges that we look at. So the more you can understand those cause and effect mechanisms, the more that you can then rationally redesign raw materials and processes to better fit to the health outcomes. So we go back to public health guidelines. I like again, the US is really good at this simplification, strong emphasis on simplifying public health messages. And of course, this doesn't cover everything, but it's a pretty good start. And this is actually a summation, if you like, of all the epidemiological data. So calorie balance is, of course, important. So that's monitoring your weight management. And focus on consuming nutrient-dense foods. And so nutrient-dense, that's a really interesting phrase. So that means of the certain amount of food, so that's the top one. So this is really about quantity, and this is really about quality. So the quantity of food is one thing, and that's really around what you need in order to survive and and is consistent with your lifestyle. But then within that total dietary need, the quality is largely dependent on how many nutrients you can pack into that amount of the macronutrients. So this is really micronutrients and macronutrients. So the macronutrients, the carbohydrates, the fats and the proteins, the micronutrients, all of the other molecules which have additional effects. So the more micronutrients you can pack in with your macronutrients, the better. So a lot of the so-called empty calories are the ones where you don't have the micronutrients in there, and this is one of the real drivers, I guess, in terms of increasing the health content. So it's not about eating more. This is the problem. You see, you don't want to keep telling people eat more, because everything you eat more, you should substitute. Something should come out. So it's about making sure that what is in the diet has the nutrient density that we can that does us good. And the corollary to that was that the recommendation was that nutrient needs should be met primarily from whole foods. Now there's an argument what whole foods are. I think that to me that means foods which have only been minimally changed from their origins. And again, we go back to the hunter-gatherer idea. So hunters and gatherers had minimal processing. Many foods would have been cooked, but not much more than that. Minimal processing, and again, that's what our bodies have evolved to digest efficiently. So let's look at some. I'm not going to give you real pictures, just cartoons, but just to give you an idea of how our bodies have really come to focus on the digestive process. So inside all of us, a large amount of the volume of our body is taken up by the digestive system. Okay, we don't hear much about it, but it's wrapped up inside us. There's a very large amount of stuff inside us is really our digestive system. So that if you take out all the way from the mouth to the end of the large intestine, you stretch it out, it would be about as long as this room. Okay, so 8 meters, something like that, of that order. Each individual, you'd stretch out the intestines, it would be that long. So that's really wrapped up a lot inside us. And if you look at the nature of that, it's also got a very high, particularly in the small intestine, a very high surface area. So the surfaces of the villi, and on the villi there are microvilli, and this presents a huge surface area. So the surface area inside of our digestive tract is of the order of a tennis court. Okay, so each of us think of the area of a tennis court, so maybe about twice the area of this room. That is the area that we have available to absorb our food. So we have a lot of opportunity. We don't need our food to be rapidly digested. We don't need our food to be rapidly absorbed. And indeed, this makes perfect common sense. The best form of nutrition is a slow and steady drip. It's not a fast and then a feast and famine type of approach. So making things equalize over a long period of time is very consistent with a high surface area and a long digestive tract. The problem from the industrialization of foods is that most industrialized foods are digested relatively rapidly and really don't use much of our digestive tract. So I sort of equate, in a very simplistic way, fast foods with fast digestion. It's not always the case, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. Generally, what you need to do to make foods instantly available often also makes them very rapidly digestible. As I say, this is a rule of thumb, not a hard and fast rule. And conversely, so-called slow foods, not necessarily taking a long time, but digested slowly is really what we should be aiming at. So, of course, the idea of fast being availability on demand, of course, that's what we all want. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to have slow digestion. You don't have to have slow preparation time. And this is the other big challenge. This is a major opportunity, and a lot of the effort related to novel food products, one of the drivers is in this area. So how do you get that marriage between instant availability or on-demand foods without compromising the digestion process such that it still takes place over a long time and gives you a slow and steady release of nutrients rather than a fast burst. And it's that fast burst, and we know about this particularly from diabetes, so that the whole point about the glycemic response, so when we take sugar in, the insulin response that we get from that, it manages that sugar. But if we continually give ourselves very rapidly assimilable carbohydrate, either through sugar or rapidly digested starches, that insulin system just wears out. Effectively, type 2 diabetes is about a wearing out of that system. Just challenging it too many times over and over and over again. So at some stage during maturity, diabetes can come in. And so preventing that is about smoothing out the carbohydrate delivery. And you won't see anything initially, and that's part of the challenge. We need to talk to people about things that may not happen to them until 10 or 20 years down the line. But the integration over time is a clear connection there between the susceptibility to diabetes and the dietary intake. So let's talk about some of the things that are going on. Some good positive news here. So certainly we normally think of food additives, so those are the bad things, aren't they? Ones with E numbers and nasty chemical names. But really the way that the food sector is going now is that additives have become very positive. So one of the big changes that I've observed in Australia and around the world the last 10 years or so, if you look in terms of baked products, the ratio of baked products from refined white flour to whole grains has shifted. 10 years ago it was clearly dominated by refined white flour. Now it's probably about 2/3, 1/3 whole grains to refined white flour. This is great. And this is a tremendous move that needs to be encouraged and continued. And over time, people have accepted it. Even my kids now eat whole grain. If you give them 10 years ago, no, bread had to be white. We have a challenge still in rice eating cultures, because rice has to be white, but no, it doesn't. Whole grain rice or rice with extra fiber is a really good target to aim for. So we've got there with wheats and grains. Next target is rice in that area. Also, getting more fruits and vegetables into ready-to-eat foods is quite a hot topic. It's a difficult one because that's about preserving the natural and often fragile nature of the tissues. Grains are a bit more forgiving. They can be processed quite hard and still retain their nutritional value and their food appeal. Fruits and vegetables are often a bigger challenge there. But it's not just that, not adding things in, it's also taking things out. So this is what I'm calling food subtractives. And the interesting thing here is you probably won't notice much of this. Sometimes it will be advertised that this is less salt or less fat or less sugar, but often it won't be. And the food industry around the world has done a tremendous job in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of slowly weaning us off, effectively, weaning us off, particularly salt. There's been particularly big reductions in salt across many categories of food, and we haven't noticed it. And that's because there was always too much there in the first place. From my history in the food industry, I know if you start telling people to take things out of a formulation, great resistance. Adding things into a formulation, no problem. Taking things out, whoa, no, can't do that, it's always been there. And it's really, but people are realizing now, particularly salt, there was more salt than was needed for the savory taste, and there's more salt than was good for us in terms of our protection against heart disease. So this taste adaptation is a very interesting one. So this is what takes of the order of many months or 1 or 2 years, but there are enough examples now around the world where salt levels have been incrementally reduced in products. Still the same brand, no difference in the packaging, and people don't notice after a while. It's the same with people notice if they start drinking coffee and tea as a young adult, typically with quite a bit of sugar, and that sugar you gradually wean yourself off. You don't notice after time. You don't need to. It's got past that. So there's still there's a bit more mileage in that yet, and that's quite an interesting take. So we don't need the high levels of salt and sugar that we often have in our products. One of the bigger ones that hasn't yet come through is really, and this is really all linked in with energy costs, and this is a bit more open for debate because the whole thing about where's that energy going to come from in the future is a bigger picture. At the moment, a lot of what we do in industrialized food is what I would call refine and recombine. So you take agricultural products and you create a refined version of that, and then you recombine it in some way. So it's quite a standard way of handling materials. In the refining process, you stabilize, you standardize, so that the thing behaves exactly the same all over the world. So that's great from an engineering perspective. You can really take that and work with it and have reproducible and predictable products. But the energy required to do that is obviously substantial. And so the challenge from my point of view, and this is where I think health and wealth really do intersect, that it would be preferable from a nutritional point of view if our processed foods came more directly from agriculture. And surely it's going to be preferable from an energy cost point of view also. The challenge will be, though, that that gives you materials which are more intrinsically variable and therefore more challenging to process in an efficient, in a highly energy efficient way and in a highly reproducible way. So watch this space, but I think that's going to be an interesting one. A lot of the current food supply is based on refine and recombine. How much can we move away from that and influence both our health, but also take care of some of the energy costs involved in that process? So that's the first three topics. I'm just going to finish off now with a personal view on looking at life from an Australian food industry perspective. What does the future look like? What are some of the things that we can do? Obviously, it will be tainted by my interests, but what are some of the things that we can do to give a future to the Australian food industry? I don't know whether you can see much of that. I'll talk you through this. So this is part of a report that was written by Deloitte Access Economics last year, and they were tasked by the federal government to look at, or to give some options for where the Australian economy may go in the future. And what we've got here are two axes. So we've got on the vertical axis is the global opportunity. So what are the sectors that are growing globally, or where the opportunity is greatest globally? And on the horizontal axis is the Australian advantage. So why should we do it? So further to the right is more advantage to Australia. Further up is a stronger growth in global opportunities. So health is right up here, but this is a global thing. There's no particular Australian advantage there. And also the size of these pieces is really about the amount of economic activity that's associated with those sectors. So let's highlight some specifics. So this is Australia. Here's manufacturing. Probably apart from media, which is interesting, media gets the worst. Manufacturing is about the second worst in this topic. So there's no particular Australian advantage, and the global opportunity for growth is seen to be negative. It's seen to be something which globally overall, compared to other parts of the economy, this is a fraction of the economy, is considered to be low. And then up here is agribusiness, right at the other end of the spectrum. So agribusiness is considered to be both a very high global opportunity, and this is, I guess, at least partly driven by the expanding population in the world and the expectation that there will be limited, or that the amount of agricultural product per person may become limiting in some sectors, and so as in terms of a value, become more valuable to us. But also the one which is most advantageous to Australia. So you can probably see this coming, but very simply, what I see is the challenge for the Australian food industry is to say, how do you take a manufacturing sector which has little advantage to Australia and link that with an agribusiness sector which has a big advantage for Australia and globally. Notice two other things up there which are also relevant, at least here. So tourism and international education. So two things, again, tourism very closely related to food and agribusiness. So this is very much related to the sense of where food comes from and the location and the emotional side of buying, of choosing food. And international education, an important part of what we do, and I can see the faces in the room, it's an important part of what we do. The people that are involved in education in Australia now will be the business partners of tomorrow. So there's a very strong business imperative to be engaged in international education, particularly in this sort of sector where a lot of people will end up in an industry position, and if there's a good experience in Australia, then they'll be a natural business partner, and that's great for everyone. So here are my three takes. This is my take on the three opportunities in general for us, the Australian food industry, and it's essentially based on our advantages. Mostly talking about export markets, but there's some relevance to local markets. So Australia, 23 odd million, with New Zealand 27 million people. That's our traditional market. It's clear, though, that there is a market north of here of 100 times that. And the real challenge the Australian food industry has now is how does it capture some of that market, or what should it capture, or what should it aim for? It's too much. You're not going to be, Australia is not going to be the food bowl to Asia, no matter what you might see in the press. That is a complete nonsense. We simply will never produce enough food to be the food bowl for Asia. So we have to focus on what is it that we are best aligned to do, and these are the three areas that I pick out in that respect. One thing that Australian food is rightly got a reputation for is clean and green. So we have disease-free status in a number of areas that are not enjoyed by many of our trading partners. We have systems for monitoring residues and so on that again are not necessarily present in some of our trading partners. So that's certainly something that is a big part of the future. It's a big part of people's desire from overseas to buy into Australia. It's a reassurance, a sort of guarantee, if you like, of clean, green credentials. But it doesn't mean we have to sit still, so there really is a pressing need for us to be able to prove all of that all the time. So we need to continually develop and improve systems that demonstrate our clean, green credentials. It's great in an advertising campaign, but where's the hard data? People will more and more be looking for that, and the ability to measure things and to track things, of course, is now greater than it's ever been. And so we mustn't take our eye off that ball. It's really important that we keep on top of that, as well as the proactive combating of threats. So this is particularly, I'm thinking of disease threats, but also potentially new understanding of whether agricultural chemical residues may be more harmful than we thought, and so on. So we need to be proactive on that and be seen to be leading in sufficiently that people have the credibility when we say that we are a clean, green production system. So the second one is probably something you don't think about quite so much, and this is really around where the food comes from and the nature of that. So this idea of linking the quality, the eating experience of a food and its location of origin. This is a wave that's starting to grow around the world. That's partly driven by people's inherent interest in understanding where their food comes from, but also a way of differentiating products from different parts of the world in terms of their growth location. I think I'll show you examples now. So the most well-known example of this is in the wine industry. So if you want to call something champagne, it has to come from just those regions. Nothing else is champagne anymore. And that's the ultimate in terms of brand awareness and terroir or provenance. So that's enshrined in legislation. But there are other ways in which you can think about that. And of course, these are other wine-growing regions of France that would have different names associated with them. And again, you're not allowed to call your wine by that name unless it's grown from that location. So this is about assurance to consumers about where their food is coming from. But it doesn't have to be limited to wine. So there's no reason why we can't connect where something has come from with the flavour that it has. So this is some work that Heather did a couple of years ago for the South Australian prawn industry, just looking at what are the characteristic flavours of prawns, and if you could make some distinctions between seafood from one part of the South Australian coast and another part, and indeed you can. And you can start to provide descriptions about what the prawns from the Eyre Peninsula tasted like. That's the phrase here. And then the marketers try and encapsulate, this is a marketing phrase here, the marketers try and encapsulate, I don't think they've done a great job yet, but this is an idea of how they're trying to connect what is a technical thing, which is the particular notes that are present within the flavour, and a way in which you can market that as something, why it's distinct, that the prawns have come from this place and not from somewhere else. So this is growing. This will come. This is a really important future trend, in my opinion. Another obvious way of talking to people about things which are uniquely Australian is things which are only grown in Australia. So it might be, the example before was things which may be grown or harvested elsewhere in the world, but of course we have a very large number of native plants and foods that are not grown elsewhere in the world and are not allowed to be grown elsewhere in the world. So these are our champagnes. Okay? So we need to work better to integrate these into our total food supply system, because these are the examples where we can claim ownership. Anything where we can get value out of this, no one else can do this. So shouldn't we be doing more in this area? And again, did some work from Heather and Yasmina, who are working very actively in this area. So you start off by just describing what are the sensory properties of these various materials, and you put it in the context of everything else. So you draw flavor wheels, and you make the connections between what people perceive as a flavor and the molecules that are present, and so on. And the important thing here is not just to do this technically, but this is a really good thing that you work with chefs, celebrity or otherwise, who can then act as your ambassadors and can take the message out and can really start to popularize some of the opportunities that are there. So that's the provenance. So understanding where something is grown relates to the final perceived properties. I didn't talk about tourism, but it's a fairly obvious thing. So tourism is, again, we are in a slump in tourism at the moment from overseas visitors because of our high Australian dollar still. Hopefully that will come down in the medium term. When we do have people coming in with tourism experiences, that's exactly the opportunity to reinforce a good time with good local food, and then go back to their home country. Oh, look, I can go and buy that. I might have to pay twice as much as I would for the local version, but I had such a good experience in Australia with this, I will go and do that. And so this is a really potent way of achieving high added value. So finally then, another aspect that Australia is renowned for, we have high quality. That means both the quality of the products but also the efficiency of the production systems. Australia has that reputation quite deservedly. And the challenges from the food space are really about turning what is predominantly a commodity business at the moment, trying to find where it makes sense to go to a speciality business. So the real challenge, if you're buying food, if you're a food producer, you want people to buy food on a dollars per eating occasion. You don't want people to buy food on dollars per kilo or dollars per litre. Too easy to compare with everything, and you drive down price. Dollars per eating occasion, that's totally different. So if you're buying something and you're saying, well, I'm going to spend this much on a meal, you're not thinking about how many dollars per kilo that is. You're thinking about how much you're prepared to spend on a meal. But if you start looking at dollars per kilo, inevitably you'll go for you'll trend down in value and trend down in quality. So that's the whole game of actually commodities to specialities, is turning people away from buying things per volume or per weight and turning them to buying per eating occasion. One of the ways that you can convince people around that is to enhance nutritional attributes, again, the health and wealth thing. And I'll show you just a couple of examples. So these are, again, just examples from the work that we're doing at the moment. So this is Tim O'Hare's work on, together with Queensland DAF, on enhancing the carotenoid profile, particularly the zeaxanthin in sweet corn. And just by conventional breeding, where you can put more of the carbon flux down this pathway to make the zeaxanthin, and less down that pathway, but overall increase the total flux, you can get to an obvious, and this colour difference really is the difference in the zeaxanthin, and so that gives you a point of differentiation with your consumers as well. So that's important, so you can actually see the difference. Look at the health, and of course there's no correlation between colour and health, but if you've got something that you can market to people and a differentiator, then that's really quite powerful. So this is growing really well, and there's a lot of opportunity here because this is to combat an aging phenomenon, macular degeneration in the eye, and that the amount of zeaxanthin that you need to protect against that is reasonably well understood. And if the current trials replicate out into larger scale, then 1 cob a day is enough to give you that dose. So another really important thing. So if you're talking about how much you need, make sure it's a realistic amount. Don't tell people they've got to eat 10 cobs of corn a day. It's not going to happen, right? But if you can do it in 1 cob of corn a day, that's perfect, because you have to buy quite a lot, but it's a manageable amount. So this sort of sets our targets. How much nutrient enhancement is good? What's the right sort of level? And then another example, and this is really around not just content but also bioavailability. So these are some plums that were developed in the Queensland DAF breeding program, and that Michael and Kent have been looking at the composition of. So these are particularly unusual in that they have a very high content of the coloured, again it's colour, anthocyanins in the flesh, and that leads to so-called Queen Garnet plum compared to the traditional plum varieties. This is the anthocyanin content up here, and there's And that leads to a color intensity. So again, you've got this sort of visual cue for health. Easy to make it easy for marketing, not necessary for the health, but it just happens to be, and that's good for us. And here the challenge is understanding how much of that actually is available in our body. So that's what we're doing at the moment, trying to understand how much of that gets released during the normal processing in our bodies, or whether we should be looking at how we can take these and process them into other foods that will control that release rate. So this is about controlling the time course over which the anthocyanins are released. So that's about the enhanced nutritional attributes, and I guess overall this is the mentality of looking at what's on the fork and challenging the farm. So this is the fork to farm approach of saying what should we be looking for in our diets of the future, what do we want on consumers' forks into the future from both a health and a wealth perspective, and how does that translate into challenges for breeders or opportunities for post-harvest processing, opportunities for selection from natural diversity that's out there, all these sorts of things. So it's about setting targets in that respect. So that's it. So whistle-stop tour around how we currently try and link food to health and how that might change in the future. Making sure that we understand that we are dealing with we are a relatively ancient organism in terms of our digestive system, and realizing that our food supply has changed much more radically than our digestive system over the meantime, and therefore there's a lot of challenges going on in the human body as we try and deal with the foods that we want to have, because we have those cravings and likings, but not necessarily in the long term good for our sustained health. And there's some of the ways in which we can address that from a health point of view around food additives and subtractives. So what can we think of adding and taking out of current foods? But also something about the opportunities for an Australian food industry, which I seriously believe does have a big future, primarily because people do care where their food comes from. So we no longer have a steel industry in Australia because we sell iron ore to Korea and then buy steel back or to other countries. And that's fine because no one cares where their steel comes from. But people do care where their food comes from. And so I think to me that's the core of the argument about why food is Australia's natural manufacturing industry and how we can helpfully work towards achieving some of that. So with that, I remember I've forgotten to show you something, so I'm going to go back to provenance just for a while. So provenance isn't just about export. I don't know how many of you have noticed that if you buy these bagged salads and so on, you'll notice over the last few months they've started putting little pictures of people on here, and there's a QR code that you can scan, and from that you can see a picture of the farm where this particular rocket salad was. You can see a picture of someone who claims to be the farmer. They often they're more good looking than one would expect, but you know. I think photogenics is important, I think, for farming into the future. I notice here there's a picture of a lady on here, but the two names of the farmers are male, so I think that probably tells you something. But people are interested. You know, you can say this is where this has come from, making a connection. So this is the domestic market thing. But there's no problem, you know, these QR codes, all sorts of information there. So we can track our food, we can work out where it's come from, all that technology is there. There's a famous demonstration in the meat industry with a cow that was tagged and it ended up in a steak on a restaurant in Tokyo from that cow, and you scan the menu and there's a picture of the cow from which the steak came from, in principle, you know. So not that you necessarily want to do that, but the technology is all there, as we know. So how we use it, and I think using that to illustrate where the food comes from and to have all the information behind that allows people to see that chain is a way to go, because the more that we demystify the food origins and food production systems, the better. Currently, we are generally rather loath to talk to people about where their food comes from. We have these glossy pictures, but we tend to ignore the reality that we do need to go through stainless steel and other process technologies in order to stabilize the foods that people want to have. So we just need to bring people along on that journey. I think that we don't want to always paint the bucolic picture, but you also want to make sure that we don't forget that it matters where food comes from, and these sorts of ideas. As I say, it's only been the last 6 months in Woolies, but you'll see it's not just in salad bags. You get it on the corn, with plastic wrap corn. You'll see it on that as well, more and more, and people are interested, so we'll continue with that one. Okay, I think I've waffled on for long enough, so I'll stop there and take any questions. Thank you.